By 1987, the Iran-Iraq War had entered its 7th year. What had begun as a swift invasion had hardened into a conflict without momentum. A war sustained by attrition rather than progress. Cities lay in ruins. Hundreds of thousands were dead, yet neither side had achieved victory. In that year, Iranian leadership made a final, decisive calculation. One objective, one city, Basra. If Basra were taken, the balance of the war, and possibly the Iraqi state itself, could collapse. What followed was not merely a battle. It was a prolonged struggle that tested endurance, ideology, and survival. This was the siege of Basra. The war began in September 1980, when Iraq invaded post-revolutionary Iran, expecting a rapid and decisive victory. That expectation proved mistaken. The conflict soon settled into years of trench warfare, missile exchanges, and mass mobilization on both sides. By the mid-1980s, Iran had survived the initial assault and begun launching major counteroffensives. But time was no longer on its side. Manpower was diminishing, economic pressure was mounting, international isolation deepened. Iranian planners concluded that only a decisive blow could end the war. Basra became that target. As Iraq's primary port city and economic lifeline to the Persian Gulf, Basra held immense strategic and symbolic value. In January 1987, Iran launched Operation Karbala 5. It was intended to decide the war. The assault was led by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Corps Corps, supported by regular army formations and large numbers of Basij volunteers. Many of the attackers were young. Some had minimal training. All were told that this operation could bring the war to an end. Opposing them was an Iraq fundamentally transformed since 1980. Under Saddam Hussein's direction, Basra had been turned into one of the most heavily fortified positions in modern warfare. Layered trench systems, concrete bunkers, extensive minefields, artificially flooded terrain. Behind the lines, elite Republican Guard units stood in reserve. Iraq had prepared for this moment. Withdrawal was not an option. The offensive began in January 1987 under cover of darkness. Iranian troops advanced through flooded marshlands, often waist deep in water, their weapons held above the surface. Then, the Iraqi defenses responded. Artillery fire illuminated the night. Machine gun positions cut through advancing formations. Iranian forces penetrated the first defensive belt, then parts of the second. For the first time, Basra appeared vulnerable. But Iraq unleashed its full defensive capacity. Chemical weapons, primarily mustard gas, were deployed across the battlefield, contaminating air and water alike. Continuous airstrikes pounded Iranian positions. The terrain became a landscape of fire, mud, and bodies. Every advance was measured in meters. and paid for with hundreds of lives. Still, the assaults did not stop. Basra's importance extended beyond strategy. Its fall would have been a psychological shock to the Iraqi state and its leadership. For Iran, capturing the city promised not only military advantage, but the possibility of forcing Saddam Hussein from power. For Iraq, losing Basra was unthinkable. This was the line on which the regime stood. No withdrawal, no concession. Basra will be held at any cost. After weeks of continuous fighting, the Iranian offensive began to lose momentum. Casualties on both sides were catastrophic. Tens of thousands were killed. Many more were wounded or permanently disabled. Iranian forces came closer to Basra than at any point in the war, but they could advance no further. By February 1987, Operation Karbala 5 had stalled. Basra remained under Iraqi control. The war itself will continue for another year, ending only with a ceasefire in 1988. The siege of Basra came to embody the conflict as a whole. Extraordinary sacrifice, unrelenting destruction, and a war that achieved no true victory. In May 1940, Nazi Germany launched a rapid and coordinated invasion of Western Europe. Within weeks, the defenses of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands began to collapse. Along the northern coast of France, more than 300,000 Allied soldiers found themselves cut off from the south. With the sea at their backs and German forces closing in, destruction appeared imminent. What followed, however, will become one of the most consequential withdrawals in modern military history. This was Dunkirk. At the outbreak of the Second World War, British and French planners anticipated a prolonged defensive conflict. Instead, in May 1940, Germany implemented a new form of warfare: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. German armored divisions advanced through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed unsuitable for large-scale mechanized movement. The breakthrough was decisive. French defensive lines disintegrated, communications collapsed, entire formations were outflanked and isolated. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian units, was driven steadily northwards towards the English Channel. By the end of May, Allied forces were encircled. Only one route of escape remained: Dunkirk. On the ground, Allied commanders faced a narrowing set of options: hold back advancing German units long enough to allow an evacuation. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill confronted the possibility of losing Britain's entire professional army. Opposing the Allies was a German force at the height of its early war effectiveness. Experienced commanders, highly mobile armored divisions, air superiority provided by the Luftwaffe. The destruction of the trapped Allied forces appeared inevitable. Then, unexpectedly, the German advance paused. As German forces approached Dunkirk, their armored units received orders to halt. For several critical days, the advance did not continue. That pause created an opportunity. On May 26, 1940, Britain initiated Operation Dynamo, an emergency evacuation. The port of Dunkirk had been heavily damaged by bombing. With limited docking facilities, thousands of soldiers assembled along the open beaches, exposed to air attack. The Luftwaffe struck repeatedly. Ships were sunk, men were killed or drowned. The shoreline became a continuous battlefield. Despite the losses, the evacuation proceeded. Naval vessels were soon joined by civilian craft, fishing boats, ferries, and privately owned pleasure vessels. These little ships crossed the channel to transport soldiers from shallow waters to larger ships offshore. Under constant threat, the operation continued day after day. Against expectations, the number of evacuees steadily increased. From a military perspective, Dunkirk was a withdrawal. But strategically, it ensured Britain's survival. The loss of those forces could have left the country defenseless and forced it to seek terms. Instead, the army was preserved. Dunkirk became a powerful symbol of collective effort and national resolve. As Churchill will later remind the public, wars are not won by evacuations. But this evacuation preserved the means to continue the war. On June 4, 1940, Operation Dynamo came to an end. More than 330,000 Allied soldiers had been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. France will soon fall. Much of Europe will come under German occupation. Britain, however, remained in the war. The soldiers rescued at Dunkirk will fight again in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually in the liberation of Western Europe. What began as a strategic defeat became one of the defining episodes of the Second World War. In the summer of 1099, after years of bloodshed and belief, Jerusalem fell. The First Crusade had achieved what few had thought possible, yet the war was far from finished. As Crusader armies pushed along the eastern Mediterranean coast, one city stood firmly in their path. Wealthy, heavily fortified, still unconquered. Tripoli. What followed was not a single clash of arms, but a siege, one that will endure for years. This was the Siege of Tripoli. The capture of Jerusalem did not mark an end. It marked a beginning. Rather than returning home, the Crusaders began to carve permanent footholds in the Levant. Antioch in the north, Jerusalem in the south. Between them lay Tripoli, a powerful Muslim city governed by the Banu Ammar dynasty. Tripoli commanded vital trade routes, drew immense wealth from commerce, and maintained a formidable navy. Its ruler, Fakhar al-Mulk ibn Ammar, was no ordinary adversary. Educated, politically astute, and deeply committed to the survival of his city, he prepared for a long struggle. But Tripoli stood alone, and the Crusaders were advancing. At the head of the Crusader campaign, stood Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the most powerful nobles of the First Crusade. Unlike many of his peers, Raymond had no intention of returning to Europe. He sought a realm of his own. Tripoli was the key. Opposing him was Fakhr al-Mulk, who relied not on brute force but on diplomacy, fortifications, and fragile alliances with neighboring Muslim powers. Yet, unity among Tripoli's defenders was weak, and time favored the besiegers. The siege began in 1099. Rather than risk a costly assault, Raymond chose endurance. He established a permanent encampment outside the city, and in 1102 constructed a massive fortress overlooking Tripoli. It was called Mons Peregrinus, Pilgrim's Mountain. From this vantage point, the Crusaders tightened their grip. Supply routes were severed. Food became scarce. Prices soared. Famine crept through Tripoli streets. The city endured, but only just. Fakhr al-Mulk sent desperate appeals for aid, first to Damascus, then to Baghdad. No relief arrived. Muslim naval support proved limited, while Crusader fleets increasingly controlled the coast. Year after year, the siege continued. Tripoli was slowly starving. Tripoli was the missing link. With its capture, the Crusader states will form an unbroken chain along the coast. It will become a new Crusader principality, wealthy, defensible, and enduring. For the Muslim world, the loss of Tripoli meant far more than territory. It marked the breakdown of coordinated resistance and the failure to hold the Crusaders while the chance still existed. In 1102, Fakhr al-Mulk was forced to abandon the city, leaving in a final attempt to secure assistance. Without its ruler, Tripoli's fate was sealed. In 1109, the city fell, and the county of Tripoli was born. But by 1102, its defeat had already become inevitable. The siege of Tripoli revealed a new truth. The Crusades were no longer expeditions. They were settlement, occupation, and permanent war. Tripoli's fall reshaped the balance of power in the Levant and ensured that the Crusader presence will endure for generations. In the winter of 1019, the survival of the Korean kingdom of Goryeo was in doubt. From the frozen northern plains, a large Khitan invasion force crossed the border, intent on bringing Goryeo to final submission. The Khitan Empire expected a decisive victory. What awaited them instead was a seasoned commander, an exhausted army in retreat, and a battlefield that will shape the balance of power in East Asia. This was the Battle of Kuju. For decades, the Khitan-led Liao dynasty and the kingdom of Goryeo had contested power along their shared frontier. the Khitan were a formidable military force, renowned for their cavalry and shaped by steppe warfare. In 1018, seeking to compel Goryeo's submission, the Liao dynasty launched a major invasion. More than 100,000 troops crossed the Yalu River under the command of General Xiao Paya. Initially, Khitan forces advanced deep into Goryeo territory, but the campaign soon faltered. Supply lines stretched thin, local resistance increased, and winter conditions worsened. By early 1019, the Khitan army was depleted and withdrawing northwards. It was at this moment that Goryeo chose to act. Goryeo's defenses was directed by Kang Kamchan. He was not a career soldier, but a scholar official who had risen to command late in life. In his 70s, Kang brought experience and strategic patience rather than physical force. He understood that success in war depended not only on strength but on timing. Opposing him was General Xiao Paya, still commanded a dangerous force despite its losses. The Khitan objective had changed. They now sought escape. Kang Kamchan intended to prevent it. Kang allowed the Khitan army to continue its withdrawal. There was no immediate pursuit. Instead, Goryeo forces repositioned themselves near the fortress of Kuju, along the Khitan line of retreat. The terrain was narrow and constricted, limiting movement and favoring the defenders. As the Khitan army approached, fatigued, undersupplied, and increasingly disorganized, Goryeo forces launched their attack. Missile fire struck from prepared positions. Infantry advanced in coordinated assaults. Khitan cavalry, once dominant, found itself unable to maneuver effectively. The retreat collapsed. Soldiers fell into frozen rivers. Equipment and supplies were abandoned. Command and cohesion disintegrated. What had begun as an orderly withdrawal turned into a catastrophic defeat. By the battle's end, the Khitan army had been virtually destroyed. Only a small fraction survived to cross back into Liao territory. The Battle of Kuju marked a decisive turning point. It brought an end to decades of large-scale Khitan invasions of Goryeo. The Liao dynasty will never again attempt a full conquest of the Korean kingdom. For Goryeo, the victory secured political independence and long-term stability. Kang Kamchan became a symbol of strategic wisdom and restraint. His success demonstrated that preparation and patience could overcome even the most powerful invading force. In the aftermath of Kuju, hostilities subsided. Goryeo and the Liao dynasty established a more stable relationship. Borders were recognized. Trade resumed. Peace endured. The Battle of Kuju left a lasting legacy. It showed that imperial ambition could be checked, not by reckless pursuit, but by discipline, timing, and resolve. On the winter fields near Kuju, the kingdom of Goryeo secured its future. In the year 197 AD, the Roman Empire turned its armies inward. two emperors rose in defiance of one another. Two vast hosts of Roman legions marched to war. One empire on the brink of tearing itself apart. Near the city of Lugdunum, in what is now modern Lyon, Rome will witness one of the largest and bloodiest civil battles in its history. This was not a war against foreign enemies. This was Romans killing Romans. This was the Battle of Lugdunum. The crisis began with the assassination of Emperor Commodus. In the years that followed, imperial authority collapsed, plunging Rome into the chaos remembered as the Year of the Five Emperors. By 197 AD, only two claimants remained. In the east stood Septimus Severus, a hardened commander forged by frontier warfare and backed by the powerful Danubian legions. In the west stood Claudius Albinus, governor of Britain and Gaul, supported by the wealth and manpower of Rome's western provinces. Both men claimed legitimacy. Both were proclaimed emperor by their soldiers. Neither would yield. Civil war was unavoidable. Septimus Severus was disciplined, calculating, and ruthless. He had already crushed rivals in Rome and secured the eastern provinces. Now he marched west, intent on ending the conflict once and for all. Claudius Albinus was no lesser threat. He commanded Britain, Gaul, and Spain, and led an army drawn from some of the empire's most seasoned legions. Near Lugdunum, both emperors assembled their forces. As many as 150,000 Roman soldiers may have stood on that field. It was empire against empire. The fighting began at first light. Infantry lines collided, shield against shield, blade against blade. For hours, the result hung in the balance. Albinus' troops pressed hard, driving Severus' men backwards. Some of Severus' units began to falter. Then Severus unleashed his reserves. Fresh legions surged forward. Cavalry swept into Albinus' exposed flanks. Order collapsed into chaos. Dust choked the air. Blood soaked the ground. The noise of the battle drowned out all command. As evening fell, Albinus' army broke. The retreat became a massacre. Thousands were cut down as they fled, and Lugdunum burned. The Battle of Lugdunum decided the civil war. Claudius Albinus was defeated and killed, whether by his enemies or by his own hand remains uncertain. Septimus Severus emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman world, but the victory came at a staggering cost. Entire legions were annihilated. One of Rome's greatest provincial cities lay in ruins. Power had been secure, but at a terrible price. In the aftermath, Septimus Severus ruled without rivals. He purged the supporters of Albinus and bound the empire more tightly to the loyalty of its armies. The Senate's influence faded. The military's power grew. The Roman Empire endured, but it was permanently altered. Lugdunum marked the moment Rome chose force over reconciliation, strength over unity. And on that battlefield in Gaul, the Empire crossed a line it will never fully retreat from.